David Henkel, Emeritus Professor, Community and Regional Planning Program, the University of New Mexico. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right on. Well, David, you teach many wonderful courses in the Community and Regional Planning Program. Why don't you first tell us about cultural aspects of planning?
The Cultural Aspects course is the course that I was invited to teach way back when I was a visiting professor in the mid-1980s. And the importance of that course is to remind us that as we undertake planning or community activity of any kind, action, whether we are working on behalf of communities or learning from communities, that we cannot make assumptions about what their values or interests are. And so the course is really devoted to try to help us think about the different lenses that we look through as we approach communities, both from the standpoint of learning about them so that we can be of practical benefit to them, but also so that we can understand our own subject position as planners in serving communities.
That's fantastic. So where are some of the places that people go in this cultural aspects class?
Well, it's varied from year to year as my sense of what we should be doing varies, and also according to some degree to who I think is going to be in the class. But basically, we include a component that looks almost always at southwestern New Mexico, particularly the Navajo Nation, and also among the Pueblo tribes. And then there's another segment that usually takes place in the frontera, which is the shared territory of Mexico and the United States. I say shared because although there's an international boundary, the people are not divided by that, nor are the natural resources. They are more of a unit than the international boundary represents. But we also look at areas as diverse as Japan and South Asia and ancient Europe and the Middle East. And we look at all of those from the standpoint of how the people and their belief systems have evolved. And by belief systems, I mean not just religions, formal religions, but behaviors and social values and how people form community. And then how they undertake city form and regional occupational form, how they manage their resources. And the intent is to allow people to realize that there are a diverse set of geniuses throughout the world, which are uniquely inspiring and from which we all can learn, but which we also have to understand if we're to work effectively with the people from those places.
So there's a lot of value there on local knowledge, for example.
Absolutely. And in one case, I know that, and we use diverse materials. Some years I've used one of the detective novels by Tony Hillerman. And this particular one, Dance Hall of the Dead, is about a crime that takes place on the Zuni Reservation, but the protagonist is a Navajo policeman, Joe Leaphorn. And so you're looking at this through a Navajo lens at a Zuni reality. And so it reminds us that even when we're at third hand, there are wrinkles and imperfections in our knowledge. And that at the very end, we know things approximately, but if we are open to learning, we can nonetheless be effective.
But it sounds like it puts us always in this position of questioning presumptions.
That's right.
You know, not to assume, but to attempt to understand.
There's a wonderful bumper sticker that I appreciate very much, which says, "Don't believe everything you think." And in practical fact, in planning, this has a particular meaning for us because while we have professional roles to play and professional skills to bring to bear, our knowledge is partial. So, in fact, we must be learning all the time.
And so that's part of what we mean when we talk about community-based planning?
I think it's at the heart of it, is first of all to be humble about who you are and what you know, and to approach a community saying, I want to learn from you.
So what are some of the assignments the students have in that class?
Well, we do. This last couple of years, I've used a book called Imagined Communities, which is the one text, and actually it's an electronic book from the UNN Library. It's a book by Benedict Anderson, who was of Cornell, and his notion of imagined communities is that there have been evolutions throughout history of what we mean by community, and that in a colonial era and a post-colonial era, often that's shaped by the way in which a colonizing power begins to talk about this other entity that they've colonized. And so as you go through the book and you begin to realize the anthropological and psychological roots of what he's talking about, of political economy, really, you realize that the communities that are resurgent, that have embraced their own identity in modern times, have had to overcome this version of themselves told by other outsiders in the past. And so by using this particular book as a consistent assignment across the course, then we read articles that I've assigned from the different cultural areas that we're working in and asked people to pick up on the threads of Benedict Arnold's argument, Benedict Anderson's argument, back into history here, right, somebody else's history, back into Anderson's frame of reference and compare them to, for example, articles by Sayyad on the Islamic city form, or even poems by Rumi. I mean, we're here talking about a Sufi poet. You think, what's poetry got to do with all of this? Well, what poetry has to do with all of this is it touches a part of us that is not linear, but which expresses wonder and passion about the world around us and the people with whom we connect. So that then papers, then the undergraduates particularly, are asked to provide 4 short papers comparing Benedict Anderson's arguments to the current readings about the culture, and then they have choices in there. And the graduate students do that as well as construct their own term paper of considerably longer scope and breadth about a cultural area that they choose. So that there's both assignments, but there's also choice.
You know, we talk a lot about community. When you bring in these various cultural perspectives, do you find that there's a lot of various concepts of community? Do you find that there's some basic similarities in how people think of what community means to them?
Well, community, as we use it, I think, is a word that that Western social science has constructed. And so one of the first things that we talk about in the course is, what do you think you mean by community? But basically, community relates to a set of values and behaviors which unify a group of people around common interests and relationships. And so starting from that standpoint, all societies have that kind of a phenomenon. But the shape and the means by which they bring about community is quite different sometimes.
Interesting. Well, you also teach courses on natural resource planning, which is one of our concentrations.
Right. I've taught a couple or three different kinds of courses. I did the Fundamental Methods course for a number of years, which looked at policy, but also looked at different kinds of physical items. For example, geology. So what are the policies which govern how we retrieve minerals, how we do mining? What value do these minerals have in our economic structures? How do communities depend upon them, and how do they cope when the value of such things changes over time? So there's that kind of interplay. In the last several years, I've taught 2 other courses that have occupied more of my time. One is a course in ecotourism, which is offered from time to time, and to some degree it is similar to the cultural aspects course in the sense that we look at different parts of the world. But here we're focusing on the natural systems and on the protected areas and the ways in which people make use of those resources to provide themselves with occupational opportunities in the absence of agricultural goods which no longer have value to support a family. That is, that the price of commodities has declined so much, and communities have moved away from subsistence agriculture, that they are now producing more and more for a cash reason. And that means that if the commodity prices are low, which they have been uniformly over since the beginning of the Green Revolution in the 1960s, it means that fewer and fewer people can actually depend upon agriculture for survival. So how do they survive in rural space? Well, they either leave and are no longer in rural space, or they have to develop other occupations. Same thing's true for mining and timbering, all of those kinds of occupations which were the heartbeat of rural economies over a long period of time.
More of a subsistence kind of economy.
Yes, but even post-subsistence, we had mining populations around the world, including in New Mexico certainly, where there were company towns set up, of local people were employed, and there were many generations of local people employed in the same industries. So in that sense, it was very much like any other kind of industrial model. But with mechanization and the reduced value of certain minerals has meant that a lot of people no longer can be employed. So we look at ecotourism not as just another enterprise form for rural populations seeking to attract destination tourists. But what we look at is the different models that would have local populations become stewards and managers of those areas and interpreters of them, which is very important also in a cultural sense, so that they can find alternatives to these fading occupations of the past. The other course that I am particularly fond of is a course in rapid assessment techniques. It's natural resources planning field methods.
And that's an area on which you've also published.
Yes, that's right. That's right. The interest here is in trying to have planning professional students learn how to take readings of the relative health of the natural systems in a local area. This means that they do not become conservation biologists, that kind of depth, but there are rapid assessment techniques that can be applied to, say, watersheds, where people can determine the health of a particular drainage over time. And this involves measurements of stream flow and health and the ability of a stream system to support life, insect life, but therefore fish life. And that also speaks also to the quality of the water in terms of whether it's potable or not, so the purity of the water. And also the stabilization of banks and the kinds of forest canopies nearby. And then we move up into the upper lands and look at the stability of soils and grasslands, so that it pertains to ranching and farming both, as well as recreation.
So you really look at it as a system.
As a system, entirely. And these are the reason we teach our students this is because over time, populations, most of our populations, certainly in the industrialized world, but increasingly in the developing world, have become distanced from the daily interaction with their physical landscape. And so they don't recognize relative health markers anymore. And so from the standpoint of a community that depends upon a watershed for its survival and the other kinds of resources, timber, medicinal plants, or what have you, that might be in an area, if you can't read that landscape anymore, you become more vulnerable to change in climate, to change in land use patterns, and so forth. So the idea here is to train the students in techniques which are teachable to others, so they then, as planners, can work with communities to equip the communities to learn how to see their own landscapes again more clearly.
So the knowledge plus the method really empowers people to have more control over the future of their resources.
Right, that's right. And one of the articles that Bill Fleming and I co-authored on this was published in the Journal of the American Planning Association, laid out the specifics of how this is done and the kinds of measurements that are used and how you determine relative health. But the main thing is getting communities engaged over time. So it's not a one-shot deal, although we may train people yearly. The idea is that the communities then go back and look every year. And Bill's previous work had him work with New Mexico high school biology students in some communities, which that became the exercise every spring, and they go back every year and they would have a data base built up over time, so they can really see what's happening.
Well, and the students aren't just learning these things in the classroom. You're taking them out into the field for periods of time.
Yeah, sometimes they get their toes cold. I've been out there where we're trying to complete our measurements with sleet and snow and cold fingers trying to write things down. This spring we were down in the Mimbres in southwestern New Mexico in the Gila National Forest.
During spring break.
During spring break. Great. Well, and it's a good place to be because although it was really cold at night, it was really wonderful and warm and clear and sunny in the daytime.
You camped out, did you not?
We did, yes, that's right.
So what did they do on that trip? They learned these techniques?
All those techniques, and actually in that case, we were working on behalf of the Nature Conservancy, which has a couple of properties in the Mimbres River Valley. The Mimbres comes out of the Black Range to the south, just like the Gila goes west. And so the headwaters of those two systems are close together. But the Mimbres goes south and used to be the system that recharged the underground basin near the Mexican border. We went to two sites by the Nature Conservancy and evaluated those, and then went down to a third site of a private property owner that I had contacted through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that was a totally different kind of landscape, and the purpose there was to give the students a chance to look at these relatively pristine areas and then compare it to one that's been more intensively used. And it was very revealing because the farmer who managed that third property, who owned and managed it, was very active in trying to keep up its health too. And in the wake of major flooding just a few years ago that blew out a lot of the structures and the irrigation systems. He went back and repopulated the riverbanks with willows and other kinds of vegetation that he'd gotten from farther upstream that, in fact, hold that bank together. So you could see the results of that, this new vegetation growing and the stabilization of the streams. It's really very exciting.
Well, I know students came back from that very excited.
And probably glad to be back in the warm again. Yeah, it was
Well,
fun.
you mentioned the Mexican border, a lot of U.S.-Mexico border. A lot of the work that you've done has been, not only in taking students down there, but in some of your own policy work has been around the U.S.-Mexico border and some of the, not only the environmental issues, natural resource issues, but how they relate also to the socioeconomic issues.
That's right. That's right.
So what's been some of your work down there?
Well, there are 2 or 3 different guys. This actually started before I started teaching at UNM. I was an official in one of the state agencies and had responsibilities for international trade, and that's where it all started back in the 70s.
And that's after you had received your PhD from Cornell University?
Well, actually, it was right before, and then I got the PhD and came back and I probably saw the error of my previous ways, but actually I'd done some regional planning for the state down there in that area.
You got your PhD from Cornell in international development.
That's right, with minors in agriculture and in planning. So the planning comes about it both from my previous work as a planner before I got my doctorate and also out of my Cornell experience. But what I was interested in was the way in which this border and other borders unite people rather than divide them. I think there's this notion that there are these lines that divide people, and I referred to that a few minutes ago. But people have made the comment that rivers actually unite people more than dividing them. I mean, they are phenomena which are between people, but because of the kind of resource, they draw people to it. So they draw them closer together. And in some ways, since our international boundaries are so recent, there were already communities, both natural communities and social communities and economic communities that were there well before, and this line was sort of put down abstractly on top of them. So the work that we've done, to some degree with the state, but particularly at UNM, has been to work on both sides of the border to get both communities to connect more. And so we did a series of studios which were binational back in the 90s, and then another one just a few years ago, which worked in the 2 communities of Columbus and Palomas. The last one was, in fact, developing a joint economic strategy for the 2 communities, where we would interview and map, using GPS techniques, the location of different enterprises. Nobody knew physically where they were, except for if you lived there. People had heard about some of them, didn't know how to get there. And the town of Palomas, which is much bigger in its urban footprint than Columbus is, had lots of little enterprises, and most people who go across the boundary from the United States into Palomas would only know 1 or 2 well-known places, but there were a lot of other places that could benefit from their custom. And so, and that was an interesting period because it was just at a time when some of the security issues around the narco-trafficking and cartels and so forth began to poke out. And my sense is that while that's a point of excitement around the rest of the country, when you are in the communities, the sense of security, etc., is very different. I mean, if you can go to any city in the world, and if you're stupid, you can get yourself into a pickle. But most places, if you're courteous and you have your eyes about you, then it's fine. And in the case, even in the last 5 or 10 years, in Columbus and Palomas, I've never felt uncomfortable. Now, again, you have to be open to local people, and you have to sort of be routinely intelligent. But our work there was not particularly compromised by any of that. We were welcomed in both communities, and both communities could see each other as being valuable. So the question was, how do you bridge the international differences to make it fit? Previous classes dealt with natural resource issues, land use, water resources. The very first one was actually a guidebook, a bilingual guidebook for both communities about water and health and schooling and housing. So our work was, again, drawn from the interests of local people, but then we brought what we knew to bear on that, and were able to give back to the communities tangible materials that they found could help them take the next step in their own planning.
Well, one of the things that's been great about your teaching and about your work is you get very involved in these regions and in the issues surrounding these regions, and in doing that make the connections between the kind of expertise and insights and knowledge and methods and how that works with folks in those local communities and what they can do with it. One of the things that I'm curious about is how you see then a larger applicability of some of what we do here in the region. I mean, there are some issues that we deal with here that have ramifications beyond this particular region. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. We also had a joint program with the Universidad de Quintana Roo a few years back, where we were helping them to set up a natural resources planning graduate program. And they are down on the border with Belize. And if you go far enough to the west, also with Guatemala. So that some of the binational elements that we were dealing with in our learning up north also applied to other border regions. And I've paid particular interest to border regions around the world, so it's not just in this part of the world, although most of our teaching occurs here. And I think that what the difference is, we've had students who've come and learned some of our techniques in some of these courses and learned other skills, and are encouraged to take them for their graduate thesis work to other places. We have a fair number of students who are doing dual degrees with Latin American studies, other with water resources, some with public health. And all of these take place in areas outside of New Mexico as well as in New Mexico. And what people do is they'll take the skills, but then taking their humility and their learning about community with them, they're able to share those with local communities. And so the practice is not only in terms of the student's thesis, but also in terms of giving to the community. As a state university, we, I think, have a special responsibility to be of practical use, not just theoretical use, to our communities, which for planning is great because we can actually be of service to small towns and to rural areas. But what I found interesting about the international work is that we can also be of value there, and we have been appreciated for that, both from Mexican state officials from Chihuahua in publications thanking us, and also from local communities in other parts of the hemisphere where people have benefited from the works of our students.
That's one of the real values of how we approach our planning at the University of New Mexico. You know, you've done so much international travel, particularly of late, and I know you speak multiple languages, fluent in 4 or 5, and active in...
It all depends upon how bad you need to eat, right?
But I don't know if there's like a dozen languages that you know in one degree or another. And I know you've done a lot of international work. There's so many pressing issues in the world today. You know, what are some of the things that you think we as planners, we as people who care about our natural resources and about our communities, what are some of the things that you think we need to really be thinking about?
I think we need to broaden our sense of our place in the natural world. Ian McHarg, the landscape architect, in his book Design with Nature, points out in one of the early chapters that one of the 2 traditions of planning and of governance comes from the first book of Genesis, where humankind is given the dominion over nature. And that has been the embrace of the Western European tradition. But the Islamic tradition takes its leading from the second book of Genesis, which calls upon humankind to be stewards of the land. Mm-hmm. We need to do both. And clearly our societies require resources that require some kind of manipulation. But when we exceed the capacities of the systems to support us, when we are too aggressive in our transformation of resources into economic products, we undercut our ability to stay in a place. And ultimately you run out of places and you don't support enough people. And it's the common good that we're looking for here. I mean, yes, indeed, you can make a pile on your own, and if you get away with it and you're not hurting people, that's fine, as long as there's enough for everybody else. But the problem is when we are unfettered in our appetites. So I think that social justice comes with sensibility. So social justice isn't just a slogan to make people feel good. It's a question of balance between social need and our capacities to learn and our capacities to form community.
Fantastic. No better way to end this interview than that. Thank you so much, Professor Henkel, Community Regional Planning Program, University of New Mexico.